Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Stuart Easton. I'm one of the founders at Transparent Choice. And if you've been to others of these webinars, you know that we spend a lot of time talking about project prioritization and PMO skills and all kinds of different things. And today we've got something a little different and rather fun, I think. Jim Smith has been a leader in project delivery for quite a while. And I spoke with Jim. We first met, I think, I'm trying to remember whether it was in a webinar or a response to a blog or something. I think it was a blog. And Jim just made a cryptic comment about having come up with a really cool way of managing prioritization. And would I like to hear about it? And when I spoke to Jim, I realized that prioritization is just the tip of the value that he can add with his experience and success over the years. So here we are on this call. And again, if you're a regular with Transparent Choice, you'll know that I like not to be boring. So today I've come to the world famous Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. So we're based in Cambridge. And I've come here basically just to emphasize the point that that history, we can learn a lot from history. You know, the challenges that we're all wrestling today are not new challenges. They've been around for centuries. Whether it's plagues, you know, there are paintings in this museum behind me about plagues in the plague in the 14th century and in the 17th century, and you know how society dealt with them. How relevant is that today? There are issues about political unrest and democracy and the role of governance, and it's all been around for years. And so, you know, in a way, that the museum behind me is a symbol of the fact that, you know, we can learn from history and we can learn from other people's experience. We don't have to live through it ourselves and reinvent the wheel. And that's really what I want to do with Jim today. There are some amazing stories Jim's got to tell. And the thing, you know, the theme that I really want people to walk away with is that adding value in project delivery and around portfolio delivery doesn't have to be complicated. It can be quite simple and quite common sense. So, so Jim, with that, I first of all want to thank you for coming and sharing your time with us today. And tell us a little bit about the history and where you come from, what your journey through life has been.
Sure. Well, I got into IT at a very young age. It was my first job after returning from Vietnam, and I had no business in it. It was purely somebody did something for me, and it turned out I really liked it. So I went merrily along for the first 10 years in IT, not realizing that I had been running one of the world's largest data centers and the world's largest privately owned network and database. It was the premier credit reporting business. And it wasn't until about my 12th year in IT when I joined a bank that I became confronted with the fact that I was now running an IT organization that wasn't for profit. It was overhead. And that was a completely foreign concept to me after running two very large data center operations on a fully burdened P&L. And so I started watching how things were done. And when you're running a company or an IT project for profit, it's completely different than when you're running one for, you know, overhead. People ask much more difficult questions. And so as I started seeing project after project that was behind schedule and even projects that failed, I started looking at why they failed. And there was a pattern, and it wasn't bad people. It wasn't unqualified IT people. It was mostly politics and culture. So the first couple of large projects that I audited, which were both in excess of $20 million, everything that caused them to fail, and these were at different companies, they all failed for exactly the same reason. The justification for the project was flawed. There was no possible way they would ever be able to measure whether it reached its goals, because the executive sponsor of the project really wasn't on the hook for anything. The project had to get started. It was immediate. We need IT programming, get going, get going. And of course, when that happens, you're writing code that you're going to throw away because the requirements are junk. And the more of these projects I did, the more that I realized all the failures were fundamentally the same. The priority process was flawed. The PMO process was flawed. And it was hardly ever the people that had those jobs who were failing, but rather their inability to do their jobs politically. So after 20 years of having a regular job, I started doing project recovery work exclusively for CEOs. And we began with, how are you going to set the priorities? There's only one checkbook in every company. And so how do you decide who gets those checks? And I've never met a company that had a process for that to this date. And that's 30 years later. They think they do, but it's kind of, no, let's all make friends. Joe needs this and Mary needs that. Let's not get in each other's faces. And then what you end up with is a bunch of projects that have absolutely nothing to do with the strategy. So we get the CEO to follow a process where, in effect, the officers are competing for the money. Like I say, there's one checkbook, and you get a bunch of adults in the room all at one time, each talking about their project and their value. And as executives in public companies, officers would call them, they actually tend to make the right decisions, but they would have never made those decisions in a vacuum.
So Jim, let me just ask a quick question then at the beginning. Right. So one thing you said there is really interesting. Actually, a couple of things I want to pull out. First one is that, this discussion, this work is sponsored by the CEO. The CEO, the person who's responsible to the board for running the whole business. Why does the CEO care about projects?
Oh, because he's tired. The ones that this was an easy sell. They never want to get involved in this. They don't. It's a hard sell. But the reason they do is the CEO is pretty much the only guy at the boardroom explaining a $17 million loss on a project. The PMO's not in there. The CIO's not in there. It's just the CEO and the board. And even when it's the CEO and the chairman, if you've got a strong board, they're looking at the CEO for, how the hell did you let 17 million slip through your fingers? And that's not an overstatement. That actually happens every time there's a write-off, or every time the capital approval was for 20 million and the project's coming in at right around 40. That's still a board issue. Those are numbers that the CEO cannot dismiss. So if you present them with an option to not have to go to any more board meetings with that story, they're all ears. And this thing is so common sense. It just simply says, you're the CEO, you have the checkbook, who are you going to give the money to and why? Because if the officers are left to their own, it's basically a negotiation.
Yeah.
You give me this, I'll give you that. Well, in this case, one of the rules is that every officer has to concur with the priority once it's done. If they don't, then they've got to speak up. So they either sign off on it or they don't. Now, when you go forward, and this is a fantastic tool for IT, when you go forward, the work IT is working on belongs to the CEO, and all the outliers who are complaining about what's getting done and what's not getting done, they're now complaining about the CEO. And the IT people don't have to take that anymore. And that's a huge morale builder for an IT organization when they know they're not being second guessed on every line of code they write. So that's what, Stuart, that's what gets the CEO to do this. I have yet to give a presentation to a CEO that didn't have a track record of having these kind of problems. I did exactly the same thing when I would intercede on outsourcing.
So let's, sorry to interrupt there, Jim. So let's dig into that a little bit more, right? So I mean, in the profile that you shared with us, and we shared in the invitation for this event, there were some pretty amazing numbers. It's $300 million here and $50 million there. So I mean, clearly the projects themselves were pretty big investments and had a big business impact. Right? If you can't save $300 million and not have a big impact on any business, that's just a very, very big number. So beyond not getting a roasting in the board meeting, what impact does being able to rely on hitting the business goal of the project and things like that, what impact does that have on the business and on the executives? And I'll tell you where I'm going with this is that lots of PMOs really struggle with what their job is, right? And sometimes when you go through and you do all the certification stuff, you could walk away with the impression that your job is to put in place templates and processes and methodologies and all this kind of good stuff. But I don't hear a lot of that from you. What I hear is, here's a business impact, here's a business impact, and here's a problem that we solved. So what are those projects for? I mean, why was it important to do this?
Well, everybody laughs when they hear this, and every CEO that I've ever said it to laughed and didn't think I was serious. But the tool that we use to get to all of this stuff is we script a 5-minute video, and it's very hard to keep the CEO to 5 minutes, but we have had luck so far. And in that video, the CEO is asking the employees to tell him or her the 10 dumbest things the company's doing that affects their success. Either things they're not doing that they should be doing, or things that they're doing that just makes an employee miserable. So that's no big deal. I mean, employees heard it. They're surprised that the CEO would ask that question. But think about this in terms of the employee engagement survey. What if a third party is collecting their answers and managers have only 2 days to execute the ones that are approved? Now, all of a sudden, you've got 23,000 employees out there getting messages, communications every single day of what's changed as a result of their input. And the more shocking the changes, the more the input skyrockets. So in that 300 million case, that was 12,000 suggestions. Once we took out the duplicates and the ones that didn't comply, in other words, they didn't justify they didn't offer any justification, they just complained, we were left with 3,900 suggestions from employees that were implemented.
Wow.
That was 300 million in SG&A, 200 million in capital got canceled, and some fool out in the hinterlands had an extra $45 million in coal inventory sitting on the ground that he didn't even have the equipment that could move the coal to the furnace if there was a big snowstorm. So the employees knew that when they sent these ideas in, somebody that was exempt from the politics and the culture was going to deal with them. And that company's stock was 17 when we did this. 6 months later, it was 34. And today it's in the low 90s. And that's a public utility. I mean, they're not known for that kind of stock appreciation. But in that process of the 10 dumbest things, there were tremendous numbers of project flaws that were being identified, where people were changing things without permission. So down here on this list, I talk about the grants of authority. I don't know if we can move that or not.
Yeah, you should be able to. Scroll that down as usual, hopefully. There we go.
See this bottom line, every company, at least in the United States, if they're a public company, they have this document somewhere called grants of authority. And all it is a list of who can spend how much. And what we found with auditing these PMOs and the projects that were in trouble is there were people who, by the grants of authority, could not buy the office chair they were sitting in, which might be $700 or $800. But they were making six-figure decisions on the project. Not playing around or anything, but they were the PMO, and the user found out that they had completely missed a requirement and had to be in, and all hell's gonna break loose if we go public with this. And so we need to drop that bunch of code you've worked on, and you need to do this.
Right.
Now, those are people making decisions who can't spend $700.
Right.
So the takeaway that I think is for this little talk is this issue here, the CEOs know where to hide project status. When everybody understands that line on this question that gets, by the way, that gets put on the intranet inside the company every week, is project ABC on schedule and on budget to deliver the original benefits used to justify the project? If yes, then that's the end of the status report. If no, then we want a full explanation. What caused the change? What's the impact on the schedule? What's the impact on the budget? What's the impact on the investment return? That's where people start cutting out requirements in order to hit the budget and schedule, which totally screws up the justification, the financial justification. And then the big one on the bottom is a serious one. Do you need help from anyone in the organization? If any of the listeners can picture themselves in a PMO mode, having to do this status report will stop 90% of the problems that get projects off track.
There's a key assumption in there, of course, Jim, which is a cultural one about blame. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Right. Yes. When we put this into a company, we explain to the CEO that what is your objective? Are you trying to do projects better, or find people to blame when they don't go well? And to the extent that we can convince the CEO that his leadership position is to make projects go well and to help people who are in trouble, not punish people who are in trouble. So once the employees hear and see this for a while, that they can actually raise the red flag, and instead of getting persecuted, they get help. Well, that changes the culture completely, and it really does work. Until you've seen this thing in action, and oh, by the way, it is 100% based on the CEO understanding that this is to help, not to hinder.
Right.
But by the time I'm selling this to a CEO, they've usually written off tens of millions of dollars when they didn't do this.
Right.
And so they have kind of a vested interest. But I've never had anybody challenge me that this isn't just a piece of normal common sense.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
so many organizations don't do it, right? And again, I think there's a message in here about what's the PMO for again, right? So there are billions of dollars a year spent every year on PPM tools and consultants to deliver PPM tools and to rework methodologies and to create templates and just this whole factory for turning out artifacts. And your artifact is one word, yes or no. Right? So for a start, what we've done, we've kind of got rid of all of the overhead associated with the data collection and reporting. And what we've done is we've pushed accountability out. Right, so we're empowering people at the same time, but you're pushing accountability out. And for that to happen, you need the cultural shift, but you also need to have some clarity, real clarity about what the projects are for. And this is often somewhere, you know, people talk about a business case for a project, and very often that business case will just be a couple of lines, and you know, the CEO wants it or the CIO wants it, and our customers will be happier, right? And it doesn't really go beyond that. And I think, you know, based on what you said, part of that discussion is around what is this project for, not just for project selection, right? Not just for the prioritization of the project, but also in implementation. If the whole team understands what it's for, then collectively they can own the result. They can be accountable for the result. Is that
exactly?
Is that, yeah? Cool.
Yeah, and one of the things that we do right up front in the justification process, let's say you're going to use net present value to just determine which projects get funded and which don't. We also have a kind of a trick, if you will, in there. To calculate net present value, you've got to pick a marginal cost of capital, and that changes based on the market. But what we do is we look at the history of them managing capital projects, and if they have a long history of screwing those up, then we increase the marginal cost of capital much higher than the market to account for the risk. Then we put the budget or the project on the phase review, which means we'll give you more money when you prove you've been smart with the money we've already given you. And that marginal cost of capital then can come down each phase of the project because we're proving that this thing is real and has not as much risk as what we've heretofore seen in the way we run projects. So it's a little confrontational at the officer level. Why am I paying a 15% marginal cost of capital when we can get capital for 4%? Well, it's because right now you don't know enough about this project to even address the risk. And we have a history in this company of risking a lot of money on projects. It's pretty darn hard to argue with that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It's managed tightly. In other words, if that PMO comes out in a year or 6 months and say we met all of our milestones, let's take another look at the project, and all of a sudden the net present value goes through the roof because they're hitting their goals and they've lowered the marginal cost of capital as a result of hitting the goals. It's just like a normal way of running business without the politics.
Yeah. Well, so what I love about this is that, you know, everything that you've said so far is borne out by good old-fashioned academic research. You know, often the word academic, and here I am in Cambridge, right? So often the word academic is used in the pejorative term. You know, that's all just academic, it's theoretical, it's not the real world. But actually, there are some, you know, there are researchers out there that are doing real research into real companies, solving real problems. And so some of those, so I want to share some of that underpins some of the things you've said. So the first one is around kind of decision making. If you look at all the research into decision making, there are a couple of things that really change the effectiveness of the decision making process, and that's all prioritization is. It's the decision making process. The first thing is collaboration, right? So this notion of there being one omnipotent decision maker is absolute nonsense, right? In your model, and I'm going to kind of put words in your mouth, and you feel free to disagree with them, but in your model, I would say that the CEO almost isn't the decision maker, he's the arbiter, right? He's facilitating
Exactly.
a grown-up discussion, right?
That's the word we always use, is arbiter.
Okay, perfect. So that's not being the voice from Mount Olympus saying, we shall do this project, right? It's somebody who is facilitating a discussion between grown-ups focused on a set of common goals and resolving common issues, right? So that's fantastic. So getting different points of view, collaboration with an arbiter, with a process, some kind of process. If you do those things, then the outcomes of your decisions, whatever kind they are, it could be prioritization, it can be choosing a vendor, it could be hiring somebody. But if you follow those simple rules, you know, have collaboration, have an arbiter, facilitator who's kind of neutral, and get input from different people and have a clear set of goals. With process, underpinned by some kind of a process, you get far better results. Now, the data, this comes from a guy called Paul Nutt. The data says that typical decisions within an organization, these sort of strategic level decisions, go wrong about half the time. The outcome is not satisfactory about half the time. When you follow those rules about collaboration and structure and process in the decision-making process itself, then the success rate jumps from 50% to about 80%, 80%. Okay, so that's a 60% increase in, if I've done the math in my head there correctly, that's a 60% increase in the effectiveness of decision-making by following that. Now, there's a bunch of research into this. The method that we use and the method that's been shown to be most effective in prioritization projects is called AHP. But actually what you've been doing, Jim, is you've been instinctively following those rules, right, to get good outcomes. And again, you know, I may be shooting myself in the foot here, but you can achieve a lot of value without big fancy processes, just by coming down to these simple ideas.
Absolutely, and the culture doesn't like that because they kind of grew up doing it the way they've been doing it. We had one project where the CIO was a brand new guy with no CIO background. They basically gave the controller the title, and I was hired to coach him. They had a project underway to build a new billing system, and it was 3 years into the planning stage, 17 million spent, and they didn't have a design yet. Oh. I looked at it and I wrote the CEO or the CIO a note, and I said, you know, Roger, if you don't cancel this thing within the first 6 months on the job, then this boat anchor is going to be hanging around your neck. Well, he was scared, literally shared these words with me. He was scared to death of writing that letter, canceling that project, because the executive sponsor was a really powerful guy.
Right.
And he got the nerve up and he did it. And the bully, if we can use that word, just went crazy. And Roger got a call from every single one of the other officers congratulating him, saying they were hoping somebody would do that. Well, but okay, fine. It's great that he did it, but think about the politics. All the other officers, including the chief nuclear officer, which is probably the most secure job in any utility, no one was saying, hey, this is bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, they're looking for somebody to do something. Yeah. And he did it. And he was a hero. But how long could that could have gone on for another 10 million, I think, if we hadn't intercepted it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And that change of culture is really, really important. So there's another little bit of data that I think would be really interesting to share, which was from a piece of research I saw just a month or two ago. And it picks up another of your themes. Which is that, you know, kind of the strategic direction, that's really the remit of the leadership team. But the people who really know where the skeletons are buried, the people who really know where the opportunity for improvement is, are the people in the middle of the organization. And there was a really nice piece of research into that looked at a particular project ecosystem, and basically 80% of the projects that were initiated by a senior leader failed, and 80% of the projects that were initiated by someone in the middle of the organization succeeded. And, you know, and it's not as black and white as it sounds. There's a lot of color to that story. But you know, one of the things that I think comes very strongly from your presentation is that those ideas for projects, that ideation, you need the leadership to set a direction, yes, and you need the leadership to ultimately act as some kind of a filter, and to kind of coordinate, what gets done and what doesn't. But absolutely engage with the organization. Don't expect the CEO or the CIO or the chief nuclear officer to be the one who comes up with the great ideas, because data tells us that generally those good ideas come from the middle of the organization, not from the top. And that doesn't mean that the executives are not smart people. They absolutely are. They're very smart people, typically. But they are several steps removed from what's actually going on day to day. Right? And that's I think is where that one comes from. So again, this is another example where Jim Smith has kind of intuited results that academics have then gone on to actually validate and prove. So yeah, well done you.
I have a funny story about how $20 million project to digitize the maps in the utility service area. And I met with the project team, and you get that feeling something's not right, but all the words were rah, 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 we're right on top of it. But I just knew intuitively that something was wrong. So this is going to sound crazy, but it was a brilliant stroke of luck, not genius, just luck. I handed everybody in the room a 3-inch yellow Post-it, the sticky stuff. I asked them to put it on the table with the sticky side up. And then I said, on a scale of 1 to 5, what's the chances of this project being successful? And I want you to write the number and fold it in half so the sticky side catches it and it's private. And quick, and I'm pushing them. And so everybody wrote down the numbers. And then I went up to the whiteboard and I said, what do you think the score is? And everybody was saying, 4, 3.5. It was 1.5.
Wow.
Now what do you guys want to talk about?
Wow.
So human nature is, it's when you eliminate the risk, they almost always do exactly the right thing. It's the risk that screws everybody up. Or in many cases, it's perceived risk. The risk really isn't there, but we have to deal with people's perceptions, not the reality.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're kind of running out of time, so I'm going to share one last story and then wrap it up, and thank you. So just to kind of reiterate that, there's a project here in the UK called Crossrail. It's one of Europe's biggest civil engineering projects, and it's lasted years, and the government's probably spent millions on teams to do project governance. Real numbers people looking at the statistics and the data and all the rest of it, and everything was green, held up as the poster child for a great project, until they got to within a few months of the thing opening, at which point pretty much everything went red. And what that tells me is that there was a culture there where people weren't comfortable or able to speak truth to power. And so, I think one of the key messages, we've talked about collaboration, teamwork, we've talked about having clarity of direction, we've talked about where good ideas come from, we've talked about holding project teams accountable. And I think just this, one of the biggest things that a PMO leader can do is work hard with the executive team to create an environment where people can speak truth to power, and where they can take responsibility for a project and for things that go wrong without being fired or shouted at or whatever it may be, but just with that mentality of let's sort it out. And I'm assuming the end of your story is that it went from 1.5 up to 4.5.
Eventually it did, but basically we got rid of the project manager and put another team of people in charge of it. And the people on the front lines were all fine. They were doing their jobs. They just weren't allowed to do the right job. If I could end on anything, I would say, added on to what you just said, this project status report where you say, yes, it's all okay, or no, and here's what's wrong. We always have the PMO sit down with us, the person leading it, and he gets 5 minutes with the CEO, and we script this for the CEO, where the CEO assures that person that the truth will save him, and that any untruths in answering these questions will be the demise of the project and maybe that person. So you will never get into trouble for telling the truth.
Yeah.
And that kind of leadership, the word spreads, and people start saying what needs to be said. But the second you throw punitive stuff in there, it's gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jim, I just want to thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting half hour. We could have gone for at least another half hour and probably way beyond that as well, as we did last time you and
Probably
I.
So.
So thank you very much for coming and sharing. And again, I think hopefully we proved that, we can learn from history. Jim's background speaks for itself. The track record speaks for itself. It doesn't need to be crazy expensive PPM tools and all the rest of it to deliver value. You just need to focus on a little bit of core process, good culture, and staying focused on what's important. So, Jim, thank you very, very much. For those of you who were able to join us today, thank you for joining. And for those of you who won't, because we've been recording this, and assuming the recording stuck, we will send it to everybody who couldn't make it today. I'm assuming that was because of some kind of Zoom problems, because one or two of the people on the call have been letting us know that they're having problems with Zoom today. So apologies for that, but hopefully you'll still be able to get the benefit of the webinar through the recording. So thanks for your time. And Jim, thank you again. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Have a wonderful day.
Take it easy. Thank you.